Kim. For another class before.
Oh, really? No wonder. Our favorite class. Our favorite.
Holocaust lecture. Some announcements. First, some students have been interested in getting a hold or being able to view the videotapes that are being made of the various lectures, especially in view of last week's stunning performance. I can understand that desire. The current situation with the videotapes that are being made week by week is that the members of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust are reviewing them and going over them with an expert in videotaping to talk about editing ideas and things like that. They will be given back to me, and I will place them on reserve in the media center in the library, sometime presumably within the next week or so. Ongoing running basis, usually a week or 2 weeks after the lecture itself, in the media center. That's where they will regularly be placed. Changes on the schedule, and by the way, if you I need to remind you of a couple of changes on the schedule. And by the way, if you don't have one of these, I've got a batch of them here. Come up after the lecture and pick one up. First, the lecture, the keynote speaker for the series, Leon Bass, is coming on March 21st to speak on racism, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust, an African-American perspective. That lecture is not taking place in this room, but it is taking place in person theater. So March 21st, in person theater, not here. Please make note. And we have had to switch the dates for the April 4th, or rather switch the topics, for the April 4th and the April 25th lectures. The American Responses to the Holocaust by Professor Les Adler from the Sonoma State University Hutchins School will be on April 25th, not on April 4th. And the April 25th lecture, Holocaust Consciousness in Germany and Israel with Alison Owings and Zeev Brinner, will be on April 4th rather than the 25th. Those two have just been switched. A reminder of the Anne Frank exhibit, the internationally renowned exhibit that is currently or is soon to be shown in Corte Madera at the Town Center Shopping Center. It'll be running from March 1st till April 7th. Then another reminder, in the Sonoma Film Institute, The Wonderful Horrible Life of Leni Riefenstahl will be shown Friday, March 3rd and Saturday, March 4th, that's this week, at 7 p.m. And the Sonoma Film Institute meets in, or the films are shown in Darwin 108. And then the following weekend, Friday and Saturday, again at 7 p.m., the Sonoma Film Institute will be showing Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will in its uncut version. I would remind you that the John Steiner exhibit of memorabilia and documents and photographs from his experience as a Holocaust survivor is currently on view in the library here on the Sonoma State campus. I urge you to see it, and I would urge the various instructors of the sections to take their sections over to look at it. The Mary Felsteiner books called To Paint Her Life, Charlotte Salomon in the Nazi era, sold out, the copies that they had brought here to sell after her lecture last week. And there are more on order in the bookstore. They should be in shortly, so if you didn't get a chance to get one, you won't have to wait long. Let me read our 50-year commemorative vignette here. This is from February 28th, 1945. The last transport of 6,000 inmates of the Groß Rosen concentration camp in Silesia, today Poland, leaves for the West. Their first stop is the Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany. Their final destination is Mauthausen, a concentration camp in Austria. Only 1,200 of the 6,000 will survive the journey. Next week's lecture will be by Sonoma State University professor Richard Paul, and it's entitled Rationality and Human Destructiveness, Dilemma and Resolution. Professor Paul is the director of the internationally renowned Center for Critical Thinking and Moral Critique here at Sonoma State, and he has delivered this or a similar lecture in previous series in our history here as the Holocaust lecture series, and I'm sure you will find his remarks incisive and challenging. This week we're going to hear about race, racism, and persecution. As you know, the Nazis claimed that society needed to be rid of Jews because ostensibly they are racially inferior and through intermixing represent a threat to the health of the ostensibly superior Aryan race. And that is the ideological basis, the main ideological basis of the Holocaust. But what does race really mean? Where did the concept come from in the first place? How has it been used and how can it be used responsibly, for example, by scientists, by geneticists? And how did the Nazis pervert it to undergird their ultimately genocidal ideology? Sonoma State's professor of biology emeritus, Paul Benko, whom you already know well, will be telling us about the biological aspects of that question, and Joel Neuberg, erstwhile of the Northern California Holocaust Center, will be looking at the ways the Nazis applied the concept. And their formal introduction will be offered by Virgil Miller of the study of the Holocaust.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's lecture. My name is Virgil Miller. I'm a member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust. Our organization is dedicated to Holocaust studies. We serve as a support group and as a fundraiser for the Holocaust Studies Center here at Sonoma State University. Today's topic is race, racism, and persecution. Our speakers are Paul Benko and Joel Neuberg. Dr. Benko was born in what was then Romania. His education began under the Romanian education system. Later, when the region was taken over by Hungary, his education continued under Hungarian authority. In 1944, he was deported and entered the world of concentration camps. He was liberated in 1945 by the American 10th Armored Division. After the war, he was adopted by an American family, moved to New York City, got a job with the New York Public Library, thus becoming economically self-sufficient, and then graduated from Stuyvesant High School in New York. In the years that followed, he served 1 year in the American Army, attended UC Berkeley, where he earned his Bachelor of Science degree in plant diseases, transferred to UC Davis, where he earned his master's in food sciences and PhD in comparative biologies. Dr. Benko has worked for both the federal government and private industry. However, he spent much of his career teaching, both here at Sonoma State University as well as other institutions. He has been a participant in the Holocaust Studies program for the last 10 years. He is currently chairman for the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust. Joel Neuberg had for 8 years been the executive director of San Francisco's Holocaust Library. He was the first person to hold this position. At present, he is the librarian at El Molino High School in Forestville. Mr. Neuberg is a graduate of UC Berkeley with a major in English. He then earned a master's degree in creative writing at San Francisco State. He is now a graduate student at San Jose State University in the area of library sciences. In 1983, Mr. Neuberg traveled to the Sudan under the auspices of the American Association for Ethiopian Jews, where he helped establish rescue missions. He is a founding member of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and is chairman-elect for the Alliance. I would like to present today's speakers, Paul Benko, Joel Neuberg.
In our division of labor, can you hear me? Okay. In our division of labor, I'm going to speak from the biological aspect, and Joel will cover later the sociological and cultural aspects. Unfortunately, the two issues will be intertwined. I like nice, clean things. You know, in science, things are very nice and clean cut. But on these issues, they're really not quite clean cut. So that we understand each other, I'm going to give a definition of racism as it's generally applied, and it's probably not the best definition, but one that is functional. And racism is the belief that a member of one or more races is inferior, and therefore the superior claim, therefore the superior person can claim rights and privileges over the inferior. Now, racism has been used to justify discrimination, has been used to justify segregation, colonialism, slavery, and genocide in all of its forms. Now, the notion of a race is a biologic concept. The concept evolved through time. It didn't exist around 1200, at least not in the times of Marco Polo. But as time went on, it arose out of a necessity. The necessity came about when a Swedish botanist by the name of Carl Linné, he was really a naturalist, I shouldn't deny him his proper credit. Carl Linné decided to organize the then known plants and animals in the world. Now, I want to emphasize that the purpose was organization, not hierarchy, and there's a major difference. So now if you envision pigeonholes, we're talking about all the pigeonholes that we're going to put plants and animals at ground level. There's no pigeonhole one above the other. They're simply pigeonholes. And the legitimate purpose of taxonomy is so that people who study the same thing in different parts of the world can communicate with each other, and that when an unknown organism, plant or animal or whatever, it can be done by some comparison to existing one, and therefore it can be pigeonholed. It does not mean, and I want to emphasize that the original concept did not mean either superiority or inferiority. It simply meant a relationship. But scientific judgment is not independent of social pressures and contexts in which scientists grew up. Now, Linné grew up in an era in which special creation was the order of the day. That means that whoever you want to call the major power said, today we make chickens, tomorrow we make mice, then we make rats, we make cows, whatever, and they each are made separately, and there is no a priori relationship at all. So he made no such assumptions. He noted differences, he noted similarities, but ultimately he had to find a unit. What's the ultimate, the fundamental unit of this pigeonhole? And the fundamental of the pigeonhole is what we still call a species. And the definition of the species is one of the great immutable definitions of biology. It means a group of living organisms that can produce offspring with each other. And that's it. It's a real hard and fast test. If they mate and they produce no offspring, you're out of the species. If they mate and do produce offspring, they're in the same species. Now, they had to deal with the reality in not only humans, but in many other cases, that there are some kinds of warblers that are yellow-throated, and then there are warblers that are white-throated. And they were going there and looking at the throat of the bird. You could call a bird by a name, but the question was, were the two throat colors due to where the animal lived, or were these really two different animals? And so they arranged for matings. Biologists are not above that. And they found that either they mated or they did not. And if they mated and produced a viable offspring, they were the same species. But they say, yeah, they're the same, but they're really not the same, because one is yellow, one's white, and so forth. So the notion of race was developed. Now, the term race has been applied, therefore, in biology as a way of distinguishing a member of the species. And that's a very important concept to keep in mind, that the term subspecies developed later on, and today we would call it a subspecies legitimately, but the old term, quote, race still hangs around, especially when we talk about humans. As a matter of fact, the term race has been applied to strains of fungi also, and there are races of fungi that live in California, and they mate with fungi that are in South Africa, and they're considered the same species because they do mate. And it was discovered pretty early in the game that if people from different parts of the world mated, they produced viable offspring regardless of what their skin color, hair color, eye color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera was. And so the term races applies to an interbreeding population where the race is simply a subdivision of the species. Now, since time immemorial, people have tried to use one marker, that is one characteristic, to define other characteristics. So we say, okay, if he's black, he probably has curly hair. That's what I mean by an association. Well, all this is very good unless you travel around the world and you take a look at the number of people who are black and don't have curly hair. Kind of upsets people, because what we call a linkage in characters doesn't really work out the way the first hypothesis said it would work out. Now, usual argument about race is that I can tell a Swede from a black. And you can, depends what you look at. Let's for a moment suppose that you're blind, okay? You're blind. You can't tell the color. Well, then you have to resort to some other characteristic. Let's take a look at fingerprints, okay? You can characterize people by fingerprints. You'll be shocked. Jews and Southeast Asians are more closely related, and as a matter of fact, Swedes and blacks and all Europeans, in fact, are very closely related in fingerprints. So it depends upon which character you use. Well, I told you about Linné, and I jumped ahead a little bit, but I'd like to talk now about a student of Linné by the name of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach is a tragic figure. Now, this man lived 80 years before Darwin. Okay, 80 years before Darwin. He was a student of Linné, and Blumenbach started looking at Linné's organization of the world. Now, Linné said the world, as far as the organization of human races is flat. There are 4 equivalent races, and these were the Americanus, guess who they are, Asiaticus, Europeus, and Afar, which was the African race in Latin. Well, he also mentioned another, in small letters, another race called Ferus, which were wild boys raised by animals, started mentally ill, monstrous hairy men, and with tails. And these were reported by travelers. So now you know that not everything was observed firsthand, and what he's referring to in these wild boys raised in animals were really what we would call mental patients today. And so he did make a note of them. But note, he did not put them in a separate category. And it was all boys, kind of a biologic problem. So John Friedrich Blumenbach was a very interesting man. He worshipped Linné, and he established a set of races in 1775, 76. This is just about the time of the American Revolution. He published a book on the races of man, and he characterized, he was in Göttingen, by the way, center of knowledge. He believed that Homo sapiens created in one place spread throughout the world. Now, this is called the monophyletic theory of evolution. It means all humans started in one place and then throughout the world, and this is as opposed to what is known as a polyphyletic theory, where humans were sort of scattered and created simultaneously throughout the world and evolved separately. And if you can believe that story, I've got the Brooklyn Bridge for you. To put it mildly, people revived this story in popular journals, but even the racist scientists don't support it, okay? So you don't have to worry about this theory about life being invented simultaneously at the same time, identically interbreeding in 4 different places at least, even by his calculation. So anyhow, John Friedrich Blumenbach examined the world, and he discrepancies in the opinions of Linnaeus, and he had a very hard time overcoming these discrepancies because he worshipped and respected this man so much. And his discrepancy had to do with more information about the nature of people throughout the world. Remember, the more people are traveling, they're going back and forth, they're bringing back information. And although he didn't take any trips, the information was coming back. So he tries to re-characterize humans. Now, the characteristics that he used to classify human beings at first were the same as those that Linné used. And Linné used color, so-called humor, and posture. Now, by humor, we mean the classical concept of humor, not the funny, but the so-called fluids which added temperament to humans. And there were 4 humors. They're cheerful, sluggish, prone to anger, or sad. Those are in the English translation of these. So it gives you an idea that if you name people cheerful, sluggish, prone to anger, or sad, you're saying more than an objective evaluation. So, but nevertheless, he used these characteristics, and he re-examined the problems. And during this period, a 20-year period between 1775 and 1795, when he publishes his final magnum opus, his conclusion of his entire work, he also does something else. He finds a skull. And this skull is of a Georgian woman, okay, of a Georgian woman. I'm sorry, not Georgian, but Caucasian woman, from the Caucasus, not Caucasian in the sense that we use it, but in the Caucasus area. And he decides to visit here and gather information, and he came with a notion that the people of the Caucasus are the most beautiful people on earth. Okay? Notice he didn't ask about their color, he didn't ask about their humor, he didn't ask about their disposition. They were beautiful. They were beautiful people, physically beautiful people. So he decides that they were really on top. Now he's in what is known as a logical pickle, because he started out with 4 groups, right? 4 equivalent groups of Linné, and he has to put these in an order, and he removed one of the groups because naturally, unconsciously, he thought, well, who are the closest relatives of the Caucasians? The Europeans. So if you are now left with 3 groups, how do you make a pyramid? You know, if you intend to make a pyramid, that's a 3-legged pyramid when you really intended to stand firm on 4 legs. And so he invents another term, and he calls these the Malay. Now, the Malay are a bunch of people who weren't characterized before by Linné. So what he's got is now an arrangement in which he has a pyramid-like structure where the Caucasians are on top and the Americans, Europeans, and Asians, and sorry, not the Europeans, but the Americans, the Asians, the Afar, and the Malay are at the bottom. They're the 4 corners of the pyramid, okay? This is. Now, the interesting thing about this man was that he was regarded as one of the most genial and tolerant men. He had a collection of black poets' works when there was, when these were literally former slaves. He was very well informed. But inadvertently, he set up this system of a hierarchy. I want to emphasize that Linné didn't have a hierarchy, and Blumenbach did indeed have a hierarchy. Well, from Blumenbach hierarchy, he speculated on various things, and he speculated, for example, on darkness as being due to the sun. By the way, this speculation went on and on and on, and it's still held today. Scientifically speaking, it's very hard to defend, because if you think of color, the truth is that the color of people depends upon mating patterns, not the sun. And it is what people believe is beautiful and attractive is what determines what the predominant color is, not what the sun is. There are people, for example, we tend to think of black as being centered in the center of Africa, and that is true. But if you go over to Asia, you find that in this exact same latitude, you find people who are light-skinned. Now, and the question is this an advantage in survival? There's a great deal of debate whether it's an advantage in survival or not. Now, sickle cell anemia is an advantage in survival. But frankly, the death rate in primitive populations, it's much more likely to due to infectious disease than skin cancer. You know, skin cancer, you know, except for melanoma, is not a fast killer. It's uncomfortable, it is unsightly, but it doesn't cut down the reproductive rate very much. What cuts down the reproductive rate are infectious diseases. So the argument whether what we consider black or white or intermediate colors, whether this is centered as an geographic adaptation, can be attacked very seriously on a number of bases. There are quite a number of theories that propose that black skin may not be an adaptation, it may be a cultural selection. Other people have said it's an adaptation to cold, some people said it's an adaptation to hot, some people said it's an adaptation to extra ultraviolet light, but there are others who believe that the adaptation, that the excess ultraviolet light is really absorbed by the overhanging cloud cover anyhow, and that this is really not a major problem, that it may be that this is a human decision, and what we're involved with is sexual selection and not, quote, biological selection. I'll return to this problem later. But suffice it to say that when we get from the Linné, we get a flat arrangement. From Blumenbach, we get hierarchy. Now, the moment that you introduce hierarchy, there is an above and below, and the question is, what significance does this have? So now we're going to leave out the man who seeded our brains with this notion, at least in the scientific literature, and we're going to turn to our friend Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a member of a noble family, as you know. He was destined to be, his family thought his destination was in medicine. He couldn't stand it. So he did study theology, and then he got his degree at Cambridge and went on to join Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. The Beagle was a ship financed by the British government to explore the living and the natural history of the world, and he went along with it. You should know that Charles Darwin was travels. He was not a robust person. He spent enormous part of his life in bed. He was really not a very healthy person. In spite of that, he accomplished a great deal. And so he traveled in 1831, 1836 on the Beagle and made all his observations. Now, the essential observations of Darwin, the ones that we remember him for now, are that first, looking at the fossil record, he compared existing plants and animals, and he found remarkable similarities. Now, if you propose that all these things are specially created, it's hard to say this one is created here, looks exactly as the one that's created there. So he began to understand that there is some kind of a process relating these things, the process that we now call evolution. But he was trying to find a reason for the evolutionary process, and he actually learned this by watching agricultural people who select various strains of plants and animals and breed them. That's called artificial selection. You take the biggest animal and mate it with the biggest animal, and you take the tallest plant or the most productive plant and so forth. So this is an artificial selection process. And he looked upon the world and he said, maybe there is a natural selection process. And if there is a natural selection process, then it would have different effects on the same plants and animals on different sites. And his records from the Beagle confirmed that. So with his careful observation, he came back and he started going over the records from the Beagle. In 1939, he married his cousin, Emma Wedgwood. For those of you who have Wedgwood china, that's right, that's the family. He spent the rest of his life in this endeavor. It took him about 20 to publish his book. And the title of his book, the first title is well known. The second title is seldom known. So I'm going to ask your indulgence while I read both. The significant book that we remember him for is On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. And the other title of the book was The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Okay. So now here the term races comes up. But what did he mean by races? Now here is a man who examined all kinds of species, plants and animals, humans included, made a point that selection by color was not a significant factor in evolutionary studies. This is Darwin himself. So he noticed that more offspring are required for replacement. Then let me say that in all species, more offspring are produced than survive. And this is where the effect of natural selection came in. And so he found natural selection as a force for survival. And he wrote a book in 1771-72 on the descent of man and the selection in relation to sex. And the essential point of this book was that the rules which he discovered for plants and animals applied to humans and well, on the one hand, that was half the central issue of the book. And the second half of the central issue of the book was that sexual selection had an important effect in evolution. Now, we tend as a prime evolutionary forces as only those forces that contribute to, quote, survival. Okay? And we don't look at other selective factors. Well, sexual selection is a selective factor. The choice males and choice females who are attracted to each other are more likely to produce offspring than those who are not. And these quote, attractions vary all over. In some cases, for example, nipple color is a very major attractant in females, or buttock size is a major attractant in females, where in males, lack of hairiness in one culture versus hairiness in another culture is a selective factor. Hairiness is regarded as attractive supposedly in Europeans, and regarded as absolutely turn-off among Asians. So, even from Darwin times, we know that it is not only survival factors, but sexual selective factors that contribute to what is ultimately a population. Now, having left us with the major ideas of evolution as a force and natural selection as a major factor in this force, he didn't explain how it worked. That, when the geneticists did that, we were left with a curse. And the curse is called social Darwinism. Now, Darwin, I want to restate it again, Darwin never advocated it, didn't believe in it, never even gave lip service to it, even though his cousin, Francis Galton, became a champion of this. So he knew about what they were up to. He did not support it at all. Now, in social Darwinism essentially says that people in a society must compete to survive. The powerful and the wealthy are more fit, therefore more deserving, so the distribution of wealth and power is justified. That's what social Darwinism is about. It justifies social classes, and poverty proves that you're unfit, and essentially that's what Herbert Spencer wrote in the late 1800s. This, of course, is a phenomenon that is used by all conquerors. And a few years later, of course, Karl Marx used it as a model of the struggle for the power between the social classes. So social Darwinism is used by all sides. It is not till the 19th and late 19th century and early 20th century where this gets its just desserts. And unfortunately, like the cat with 9 lives, it survives. Now it's called the bell curve, but that's another story. Well, what's a contemporary view on race? The contemporary view on race can be examined in a number of ways. Well, first of all, if you take a look at anthropology textbooks, you find that among anthropologists, the first champion of not structuring race in a hierarchical fashion was Boas. Boas was an early American anthropologist, and in 1912, he did an interesting study. He studied the head shape of immigrants. Why the head shape of immigrants? Because the people who believed in the special creation, people who believed that genetics were immutable, unchangeable, and so forth, said that head shape determined intelligence. So it was not only hair color, skin color, curly, but shape of the head, you know. And he said, okay, if the shape is so good, we're going to study what the head shapes are like. And guess what? Head shapes varied of offspring. They didn't stay constant. Now, we know that. But at that time, 1912, this was a revolutionary discovery. And he wrote a paper saying that these associations which we make, these linkages, are artificial. They're not real. And we may better take a look at what we describe as a racial characteristic as being an index of other characteristics as well, because at least head shape doesn't hold. So I know you're not entranced with head shape studies, neither am I. But, you know, for 1912, this was saying that the emperor has no clothes, because the predominant anthropology school was at Harvard. And there were only something like 8 or 10 PhD granting institutions before the Second World War, by the way, in all of the United States. And Harvard was the leading school, and the people at Harvard definitely believed in the hierarchy, and they were very firm about it. Boas was the champion against it, and of course, all the graduate students who come from Harvard followed in that line, and Boas's students followed in the other line. So if you take a look at the textbooks, The textbooks turn out that if they're written by authors who got their PhD before 1960, they believe in the splitters evolution. That is, that they're different races, they evolved from each other, they're not one, really. And the lumpers come after 1960 who say the concept of race can't be justified by anthropologic measurements. You cannot justify it by measuring length of the femur and diameter of the head and all of these things which were used, because they're inconsistent. And the fundamental truth about human populations, of all human population, is that the variability within the group is larger than the variability between groups. In other words, the range of heights, the range of intelligence scores, the range of eye colors, the range of skin colors is greater within a group than between groups. And that's the truth. Now, to explain this is embarrassing if you believe in immutable genetics, and so people try very hard. But meanwhile, other studies came to the fore, other studies by which we can study characteristics that are not necessarily visible characteristics. Now, lactose deficiency or lactose intolerance, otherwise known as lactase deficiency, is one that many people here are familiar with. Without looking at their skin color, I can tell whether you have it or not because I taught nutrition. But that's because I know the answer to the question. However, you couldn't tell by standing in front of a mirror whether you're lactose tolerant or lactose intolerant. You actually have to drink some milk and get diarrhea and headache and all that before you discover that truth. But if you start characterizing people in the world based on their lactose intolerance, you're going to find some very strange companions. Yes, it's true that Northern Europeans are usually lactose tolerant, but so are the Xhosas. The Xhosas live in South Africa. There are people around the globe who are lactose tolerant and lactose intolerant. You cannot link it to skin color. Okay, let's take a look at the resistance to malaria. Everybody's heard about sickle cell anemia. It gives you an advantage if you live in a malarial belt. But says that the belt of malaria is much larger than the sickle cell anemia belt. So if you're looking at sickle cell characteristics, you would link certain populations together. But if you look at malarial resistance characteristics, then you would link Northern Europeans with some blacks and some Asians, because you use those mechanisms for inhibiting malarial growth. Sickle cell anemia is not the only way of resisting malaria. So this is called concordance of characteristics. That is, one characteristic goes with the next characteristic, goes with the next characteristic, then you have a concordance. Now, among birds, you can do that. But with humans, we keep failing. But the fact that people keep failing doesn't keep people like the authors of the bell curve from trying, and they're trying again. So the fact is that no one can say that we know all characteristics are non-concordant, we know that all characteristics are not concordant because so many different varieties exist. But we do know, however, that we can't draw a simple line by which we can associate people. There's no simple line. So back to our question, what is the current view of race in anthropology? In the current view of race in anthropology, the majority of the textbooks, which reflect the majority of the scientific thought, that it is impossible to draw reliable, scientifically measurable characteristics, including IQ tests, the bell curve notwithstanding, including IQ tests, which are so linked that one could characterize a people. Now, there is a minority of people who still maintain race as a valid concept, but they admit that the use of race in anthropology has been misapplied in many cases, and they're reluctant to use it because it's been used for social exploitation and such. Now, there is another school of thought here, and we have to notice them. And that school of thought is, we have to ask the question, when is the concept of race useful? Is it useful ever? And unfortunately, it is. And it's of help in only two situations. One is in forensic anthropology. When you find a body without a head, without legs, you're part of a body, what they do is they call him forensic anthropologist. And he takes a look at the joints and he says, this, assuming they know pretty much the distribution of the population of the area, and they make pretty good educated guesses about the nature of the cadaver or the nature of the skeleton. Now this has a utility, but this is very separate from using this as a basis of legislation, as a basis of social rules, as a basis of making social norms. And the other situation in which race is a concept is in tracing diseases and disease relationships, because there are certain risk factors that are associated more with some races than others. And since no one is knowledgeable about everything in the world, people in medicine like to maximize their chances of discovering the cause. And therefore, if you walk in there and you have chills and you're feeling tired and you can't work and you have a low blood count, they're going to check you for sickle cell anemia right quick, or they're incompetent. But that's a very different story from using race as a factor in social planning. Let me just say a couple of words about the bell curve. No doubt you've heard about the bell curve, the book by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray of Harvard. Herrnstein we can't blame anymore because he passed away, but Charles Murray is still on the talk circuit. Now, in examining a book like the bell curve, which is a rehash of several other similar books in this ilk, there are certain fundamental assumptions made, which I like to talk about for a minute. You can read the book and make up your own mind. I'll let you, with this background, you're now prepared to evaluate the book. But there are fundamental assumptions, and these fundamental assumptions, there are four of them. One is that intelligence can be measured by a single number, one. The second one is that intelligence alone is capable of ranking people in a ranked order. The third one, in a ranked linear order. The third one is that intelligence is genetically based. And the fourth one is that it's immutable. That means unchangeable. Now, if you take those four fundamentals, and if any of those are wrong, this house of cards falls. Now, using their own data, the variability in their intelligence scores is 40 to 80%. In my book, that's a factor of 2. 2. That's not what's considered as high confidence level in science. One. Second, if you apply these measurements to the intelligence tests themselves, it turns out that the differences amount to plus minus 10%. Now, I would not care to make bets on my salary or even my pocket money with errors like that, much less base entire social policy on it. What they are saying in this book is that it is not worthwhile to interfere in the development of people because they're predestined. Now, in spite of what we know about DNA, in spite of what we know about molecular biology, people are not predestined. They are not. People are the development of the interplay of their genes, their culture, their development. It is not an inevitable outcome. Development is a combined outcome of the individual, the society, and the education and the environment. It is not a single factor. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about, see, I gave you this time to stretch, and I stretched out. See if we can stretch this. Yes, sir. Okay. That's it. It's as long as it gets. It's all right. It's all right. This is an affliction. Charles Darwin, by the way, was born the same day as Abraham Lincoln. That's all I know about Charles Darwin. I know a lot more about Abraham Lincoln. I learned it in self-defense. Okay, that's I won't lean on it. Okay. Oh, all right. Now I feel like Lenny Bruce. Okay. All right. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what Nazis did with the race concept. All right. And what they did with it is they built their hierarchy largely, as Paul touched on, because they had plans to conquer the world and they had to establish their fitness to do this. All right. I've given you 2 handouts. I'm sorry. This is, I guess, the first time I've been here where there's this many people, but I do have the originals or the original copies, and we can make more copies for people who didn't get them this time. The one, just single, double-sided one that tells you who was a Jew was one of the 2 basic Nuremberg laws promulgated in September 1935. The other was the of Reich citizenship, and it told you who a German was. All right. Well, right now I don't care too much about who a German was, but suffice it to say that a German had all the rights and privileges of a citizen of the Reich, and a German was defined in terms of their blood. Okay. And there were Germans who weren't living in Germany, but they were still Germans because they had come from German stock. All right. and a Jew was the other side. A Jew was essentially the other race, although we'll talk a little bit about where the Poles fit into this. I've been getting a couple of phone calls. People, I had an article published in the paper last week, and people are accusing me of prejudice against Danes. Let me say that, and in favor of Poles. Let me say that if I have any prejudices, I don't tend to favor Poles over Danes, but I do feel that people should get the facts of what happened in history straight. Okay. In any case, the Danes and the Poles had their place in this hierarchy of Nazi race science, but the Jew is on the bottom, right? And why? It's not totally clear. In 1924-25, when Hitler was writing Mein Kampf, in jail, by the way, he was writing it in jail, because he had already made moves to essentially to overthrow the government, and he was establishing or expressing things that he had already expressed. So Hitler was expressing these ideas about race in the early 1920s. It was codified or embodied in Mein Kampf, actually the second volume of Mein Kampf, more so than the first part. But in any case, a lot of it was about race. I say that it was codified. Is there anyone in here who has read Mein Kampf? Okay, there's two of us. It's not a fast read. It's not, it's very difficult, in fact, to remember. You sort of get the feeling, didn't I read this before? You know, didn't this come up once before? There's a lot of kind of ranting about race. One of the things that Hitler said in Mein Kampf about race was that the pollution of Jewish blood goes on generation to generation to generation. Right? So logically, any, at least by his idea, his theory, any amount of Jewish ancestry would make you unfit to be racially pure. Right? But it didn't work out too well, because it turned out that Jews had lived in Germany for something like 1,000 years, I think. And people being what they are, there were a certain amount of interbreeding that happened. And one of the things that the Nazis discovered fairly early on, in fact, one of the people who was responsible for writing this basic Nuremberg law discovered that he had a Jewish grandmother. All right. Well, if he had a Jewish grandmother, we want to make sure that he could still retain his citizenship in the German Reich. So there were a number of compromises that went on. This ended up being the law. I'm going to read what I have here to you so you can get some idea, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the inconsistencies in this. This is the law for the protection of German blood and German honor. As I say, there was also the Reich citizenship law. Anyone with at least 3 full Jewish grandparents is a Jew. Right? Anyone with 2 full Jewish grandparents and who belonged to the Jewish religious community as of the date the law was promulgated, or who joined later, or who was married to a Jew then or later, or who was the offspring of a marriage contracted with a Jew after the date of the promulgation of the law, or who was born out of wedlock after 7/31/36. Those of you who are good at math can figure out that this is a little more than 9 months after the law was promulgated. So in other words, if you go ahead and continue to have relations with a Jew after this date, then you're going to produce legally Jewish offspring. The offspring of extramarital relations with a Jew. A person with 2 Jewish grandparents outside of the categories named above was designated as a Mischling first degree. A person which is a mixed person, okay. A person with 1 Jewish grandparent was designated as a Mischling second degree. All right. People with one Jewish great-grandparent, that is somebody who was 1/8 Jewish by blood, were considered as of German blood. All on that first day, and by the way, previous to that, there had been lots of racial legislation talked about, proposed, lots of discrimination based on race. But this was the beginning of codifying it. It was posted. This became the law of the land. This became the law of the land, by the way, on the same day that the Reichstag ceased to exist as a legislative body. It became the law of the land shortly after Hitler had consolidated his power, eliminated some of the internal opposition. This became the law of the land essentially once Hitler's newly consolidated Nazi party was totally in charge of Germany. What did it regulate? Well, basically it regulated marriages, right? Marriages and sexual relations, which makes sense. You know, if what you're worried about is race, this is what you have a race law for. This wasn't the first country in the world to have a race law. This particular law, in fact, came from legislation or rules that were put out by churches in the Middle Ages. They just didn't base it on race. They considered Jews to be people who had a certain religion, and in fact, in the Middle Ages, if you were a Jew and you wanted to stop being a Jew, you could stop. All you had to do was to convert to another religion. And there were laws like this that said if you were a Jew, you couldn't have servants in your household under the age of 45. They didn't want to have Jews having sexual relations with Christians. All right? So there were laws passed in the 1200s, 1300s. Okay. The main difference was that there was no sort of racial definition of who a Jew was. So that in fact, large people, they weren't as devoted to Judaism, or persecution was such for practicing their faith that they gave it up. In fact, many of those Christians in Germany probably were descended from people who 500-600 years before had once been Jews. So the whole concept of defining Jews as somehow people that carried a certain kind of blood was new, at least to the system of persecution of Jews that had been in effect in Europe, let's say 500 years before this. That same day that this law was promulgated, Hitler made a speech to the Reichstag. He said, if the attempt at legal regulation, among other things, if the attempt at legal regulation fails again, right, what he's referring to is that there were attempts to regulate what Jews could do. Right? What Hitler and the Nazi Party and those who followed him were trying to get across was that the Jews were this inferior race. They eventually were coming around to blaming all problems that occurred in Germany on the Jews. So they were trying to regulate the Jews. But what were they trying to regulate? In what way were they trying to regulate the Jews? How were they going to stop the problem? What was the problem? The problem was that there were Jews. Right? They said that the problem was the Jews had too much economic control. The Jews were blamed for the defeat of the Germans and the Allies in World War I, in spite of the fact that there were a significant number of Jews who fought for, got medals for, were very loyal to the German government, were army, career army people. The international Jew was responsible for the problems of Germany. We wanted to regulate the Jew. So we defined him. We separated him off, and we said, we'll make some kind of law to take care of the problem. Right. If the attempt at legal regulation fails again, I thought that was funny. Well, that's how we should have straightened this thing out in the first place. Thank you. The problem will have to be transferred from law to the National Socialist Party for a final solution. Okay, this is 1935. All right. The final solution at this point is just hinted at, although previous to this, subsequent to this, Hitler often referred to the final solution as being the destruction of European Jewry. 1925, on this same handout, there's a quote, give you some idea of where Hitler's ideas were coming from. A folkish state must therefore begin by raising marriage from the level of continuous defilement of the race and give it the concentration of an institution which is called upon to produce images of the Lord. Now, those of you, I assume most of the people in this course realize that the Nazi Party was not exactly a pro-religious organization. I mean, in addition to what was done to the Jews, organized religion did not fare well when the Nazis were in power. But here in 1925 and subsequent to this, well into the 1930s, Hitler is talking about produce images of the Lord and not monstrosities halfway between man and ape. Okay. Okay. So what was this law for? This law was for separating off the Jews, and this law was for making sure that there was no way out. Someone said that at one time they made it impossible for us to live among them in Europe as Jews. And then, let's say in England in 1290, they made it impossible for us to live among them at all. They just banished all the Jews from England. In 1492, and in Spain, in 1494, in Portugal, they made it impossible for us to live among them, to live as Jews. So people, many people converted. The rest of the people left. Right? But it was up to the Nazis to make it impossible for us to live at all. And this was the beginning of that. Right? Race was something that you couldn't avoid, okay? Just as in this country, when someone had a certain skin color, even if they were legally a free person, when slavery existed in this country, if they were found in the area where slavery existed or was legal, they would have a hard time convincing someone, they would have a hard time defending their rights, they would have making it clear that they were not a slave and should be treated as a free person. In fact, you didn't see a whole lot of people traveling through the South in the United States as free black people doing work there, although in some sense they should have been able to, right? Slavery, it was possible to become free from being a slave. All right? What this is saying is that it was not possible to become free and live in any area that the Germans control. Okay. They use this to focus the hatred or the blame of the other race. By the way, name 3 Nazis. Yeah, give me their names. Hitler, Brunner, Brunner. Oh, you guys had Mary Felsteiner here. Okay, he's not one of my tops. You know. Eichmann. Okay. Himmler. Fassbinder. Okay. Goebbels. Somebody mentioned Goebbels. Okay. What did an Aryan look like? What were the racial characteristics of an Aryan? Come on, we've got people in here that are. Where's Dr. Steiner? Is Dr. Steiner here? Dr. Steiner looks like an Aryan. Okay. All right. This is not a racial slur, okay? By the way, the fact that I'm not a scholar, I'm also not a sociologist. Everything I know about history I learned from the history teachers here at Sonoma State. Everything I know about sociology I learned from Dr. Steiner. But he looks like an Aryan, all right? I don't know what he looked like before his hair got this white color, all right? But he's tall, he's imposing looking. To a certain extent, with a lot of extra help, Arnold Schwarzenegger looks like an Aryan, right? I do not look like an Aryan. Right? On the other hand, right, neither does Paul, okay. Okay. Neither did Hitler. Neither did Joseph Goebbels, okay. I guess to some extent Goering looked like an Aryan. But really, there weren't a whole lot of the big-name Nazis that had achieved racial Aryan looks when this was set up. They wanted everyone to look like Danes, okay. That's the kind of, or at least, now there's a racial slur against the Danes. They wanted them to be blonde-haired, blue-eyed, tall, muscular, and they claimed that these were racial characteristics and you could breed for these. And in fact, even though the Nazis said that the Poles were Untermenschen, among the things that they did to the Poles when they came through Poland was they kidnapped blonde-haired, blue-eyed Poles. They brought them back to Germany, and they raised, I'm talking about small children, preschool children, and they raised them as Germans, and they bred them with, or planned to breed them, with Germans, and this was going to be part of usable Aryan stock because they looked right. As far as I can tell, they didn't have blood tests, they didn't have, I don't know, how do you test for those things? We certainly didn't have DNA at that time. They just kidnapped Polish children who looked right, put them aside, and actually gave them to childless German couples to raise, and thought they were doing a service. I'm not sure what they told these couples that they gave them to, you know, where they got these children. So it was a little inconsistent to start with, right? We had Hitler and Himmler and Goebbels and people who didn't meet the Aryan type. A gentleman at the Holocaust Center in San Francisco in 1987, the 49th anniversary of Kristallnacht, we had a number of people come in and just give a little talk about what they were doing on that November night in 1938. This man was actually a couple of days before that was a law student. Okay, he looked more like an Aryan than Dr. Steiner. Okay, he looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, I saw this guy 49 years later, and he was at that time in his 70s, and he was a very imposing gentleman. All right. However, he was Jewish. He was in 1937 Jewish and a law student in Germany, which is an astounding thing because after these laws were promulgated and the marriages were outlawed, then came the sort of additions and codicils and revisions of the basic Reich citizenship law and the basic Nuremberg laws, and what eventually happened was that by law certain positions, certain activities were forbidden to the racially inferior Jew, among them the right to teach in a university, the right to go to school with Aryans, and part of the Nazi was to teach race science. So in law school, of all places, they would have lectures about how you could tell people apart. You know, how you could, why it was that we were making this program. We were going to bring the supermen into control of Europe and how they were different from the others. I imagine it was in an auditorium about this size. Everybody's a law student. They're getting their race science lecture for the month. And the professor in my position, who is teaching race science, looks around the audience and points at my friend the Jew, who looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and says, come up here. And he gives a little 1 or 2 minute evaluation of this perfect specimen of Aryan manhood. Most of this guy's students in the class knew that he was Jewish, which is an astounding thing to me. At least is what he said when he talked to us 10 years ago. They knew he was Jewish. He got up there. He was the example. He was the sort of skeleton on the hook as the primo Aryan. No one, then he got to sit down, you know, everyone oohed and ahed. He sat down, and he never went back to class, and essentially as soon as he possibly could, after the next couple of days of disturbances, he got out of the country. No one turned him in. Now, I don't know, there were maybe 75, 80 people in this room. They were all Germans. They were all benefiting from this new world order. They were all declared to be Aryans, even though some of them, like Joseph Goebbels, would be what we call today disabled. You know, he walked with a limp. He had actually what, when I was growing up, would be called a Jewish. He was declared to be an Aryan, and this system of the Superman benefiting the Aryan was going to benefit everyone in this classroom. Certainly nobody felt it incumbent upon them to point out that this prototypical Aryan that they'd just given the lecture about happened to be a Jew. Okay. So it didn't really work, okay, from the way it was planned to work, or the way biologically one would think that something like this would work. Part of the system was to make a better race. We were breeding, as Paul talked about, breeding large animals with large animals to get more large animals. You know, you breed cows that give lots of milk with other cows, well, with bulls, I guess, that have a reputation for producing cows that give milk, and you get cows that give lots of milk. And certainly in the United States and in this area, we've really figured out how to do that. And I guess they were going to figure out how to do that. So you'd have guys that were my height and had Arnold's muscles and didn't need eyeglasses and whatever, right? Supermen. And superwomen also, whose main role was to breed. Okay. But it didn't make sense. My take on this is it didn't make sense to anybody. Well, or very small numbers of people. They had a variety of medical and race institutes. They had people studying skulls. Just as an example, the medical experiments that were done in some of these concentration camps, I think any doctor will tell you that they were in no way medically productive. They were really torture, right? But torturing, who were they doing medical experiments on? Jews. So they would do things like get you soaking wet, see how much, Jews and gypsies actually, a lot of gypsies. They would soak you in ice water and see how long you could survive. This was to see, ostensibly, medical research to see what will happen when German pilots are shot down during the war, okay? Well, if the Germans are Aryans and they're a different race and they're the superior race, what is the point of doing experiments on the Jews who are an inferior race? And anyone would be able to tell you that they're inferior. They're not going to be able to resist the same kinds of conditions that the Germans are going to resist. So it didn't make sense from that point of view. But it worked for what they wanted it to do. Okay. If you'll turn to the second handout. So as I said, over time, based on race, and by the way, even this system, where you had to have 3 Jewish grandparents to be considered Jewish, right? So what happened? People who were Jewish and happened to have less than 3 Jewish grandparents, this is okay. I've escaped, all right? I mean, I'm sure that they were not ecstatic. You know, they were not happy about this. But But if they were not affiliated with a synagogue, they only had 2 Jewish grandparents, there was a place they could go. They could register. And it could be determined that, in fact, they were not a Jew. All right? Maybe they only had 1 Jewish grandparent. They were a Mischling second degree. Maybe they had 2 Mischling first. They were not a Jew. They were not going to be treated like a Jew. They could hold certain jobs in the beginning. They registered. So in addition to all the Jews, all these part Jews were identified. Right. Time went on. Right. What happened between 1935 and let's say December 7th, 1941? Well, in Germany, what happened was increasing discrimination and isolation of the Jews. What happened was thousands of Jews, those who could get out, left. Some of them went to places where they would later be captured again or caught again in the expansion of the German Reich. Some went to Holland, some went to France, some went to Belgium, some went to Denmark, a lot went to Poland, some went to the states that, places like Slovakia and what we now call the Czech Republic, and they went all kinds of places. Right? Some of them went back to places where they had come from before they came to Germany. Right? They went where they could get in. Any place was better than Germany between 1935 and 1939. In 1939, the war started. September of 1939. It was much more difficult to go anywhere. By December 7th, 1941, it was impossible to go anywhere, really, for Jews, certainly in Germany, and to a lesser extent, any of the places occupied by Germany, or having certain relationships with Germany. All right. In this time, the whole concept of Jews as a race spread. It spread wherever the Nazis could make it spread, and it spread some places where you wouldn't think the Nazis had too much control. Switzerland, which was a neutral in the war, early on proposed, because they were having refugees coming out of Germany because things were difficult there, they had all the Jews in Germany, they suggested to the Germans that all the Jews have their passports stamped with a J. Right? This was an idea that didn't come from inside Germany. In 1938, even though there had been a fascist government in Italy since 1922, it wasn't until 1938 that these same laws started to be promulgated in Italy. Right? The Italians weren't much into the racial aspects of it. Oh, by the way, who were the allies of the Germans in World War II? See, I'm a student again, and I'm taking classes teaching people how to teach high school. I'm actually trying to be a high school librarian and pick literature. And one of the things that we all wring our hands about is that no one under 30 knows geography. Right. All right. Italy and Hungary were World War II allies of Germany. And any other allies? Russia, before June of 1941, was an ally. Okay. Any other allies? Huh? Yes, Romania is a very skilled side changer. Yes. And Italy, in fact, would have or had opportunities and looked for sides to change, and was not always was looking for the winning side. Many of these countries were looking for the winning side. Japan, I heard Japan come up here. Who lives in Japan? Japanese. What do they look like? Not like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay. These were the allies of the Germans. The Japanese had their own sort of racial ideas, but you can bet that they weren't the same racial ideas that the Germans had. I suppose in some ways they couldn't tell the German Jews that had fled to Shanghai and were living there from the Germans that they kept having these meetings with and tried to coordinate their war effort with, you know, in a kind of visual way. The Japanese that learned German in order to communicate with their Nazi allies also spoke German to these Jews that were hiding out in Shanghai, being treated, by the way, substantially better than they were being treated in many of the European countries. So it didn't work there very well. Nobody seemed to care. Japanese didn't look like Aryans. They were the sort of Aryans of the East. All right. Okay. Wherever the Germans went, as they were successful in taking over territory, they took over Jews, and wherever they went, they made every effort to impose the Nuremberg laws in order that these countries would operate essentially the way they were operating and isolate the Jews and be ready eventually to deport the Jews and eventually to murder the Jews. Right? So they singled them out on a racial basis. December 7th, 1941, what happened then? Do young people know history? Pearl Harbor, okay, all right. My own feeling is that in combination with what happened in June of 1941 and what happened in December of 1941, in many ways the war was over on December 8th, 1941. The Germans were now fighting the Americans and the Russians. They certainly didn't think it was over. The people that were in those camps didn't think it was over. There were 2.5 years left of fighting, but in some ways the die was cast. I'm not sure anybody knew it at the time, but it certainly was good news that the Americans were in the war and that the Soviets were fighting the Germans at this time. On December 8th, 1941, Heydrich, who was another of these Nazis, unfortunately he was one that looked like an Aryan. And in fact, all through his fairly brief career as a Nazi, there were rumors circulating through Europe that he had Jewish ancestors. I mean, this was a guy who looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and people talked about the probability or the possibility that he had Jewish ancestors. And anyway, he met with a small number of people under instructions from above to set up a meeting which later took place in a place called Wannsee, kind of a villa just outside of Berlin, January 20th, 1942. And what was decided then was, well, what was discussed then probably had been more or less decided before then, was the final solution to the Jewish problem. And remember, we said that the Jewish problem is that there are Jews. And this handout that I have here is a translation of the notes from this meeting. It's used at the Nuremberg trials, which is not to be confused with the Nuremberg laws. Nuremberg trials took place in the same city of Nuremberg, 1945 to 1947. This is what the Nazis thought they had in terms of Jews. They were wrong here also. These numbers are their numbers. I'm not quite sure why they didn't think they had any Jews left in Estonia, because you know, there were Jews still there and there were Jews killed there. They had too many Jews in one place, not enough Jews in another place. Anyway, this was their statistics. This is what they thought the job was. And the job was, as you'll see as you go through this, to kill all these people. Okay. And if you turn to what, this is great, they had, this, by the way, I'm a librarian, so as I say, I don't learn anything, I just learn where stuff is. And what I try to do is to get a couple of books that I keep at home, and we're also making sure that a significant number of these books are at the Sonoma State University Library, which has been building up its collection of books on this subject for a long time, that has all the essential information in it. One of these is a book called The War Against the Jews by Lucy Davidovich. Since she wrote that book, I don't know, something like 25 years ago, there's been new information, but it's still sort of a basic, good book to read. For those of you who can deal with sociology, there's a book called what is it called? Something of Accounting for Genocide by Helen Fine, which tries to, which I have some maps in your handout. Tries to account for why Jews in some places and didn't survive in others, and part of that has to do with what the anti-Semitism was, when they passed the racial laws, how well they enforced them, how much they believed this stuff, how much they acted on this. All right. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. All right. You've got pages, but basically this was the outline, and you will see that at this meeting where they're discussing killing all the Jews, they talk again about who is a Jew. Okay. This is important, right? Because now they're going to have to round out. It's not just that these people aren't going to hold jobs. It's not just that these people aren't going to go to school with your kids. They have to find them all. They have to decide, are you one? You know. And they talk about exceptions. I think I'm on page number 11 here. Persons of mixed blood of the first degree, all right, the first degree is, I guess, 2 Jewish grandparents, married to persons of German blood if their marriage has resulted in children, all right, so now we've got second degree mixed people, persons of mixed blood of the second degree. Such persons of mixed blood of the second degree are to be treated essentially as Germans. Why? Their parents were Jews. Why treat them as Germans? I think that one of the reasons for this is because it would be difficult not to. If the parents weren't full Jews, or if there was some utility seen in keeping the parents alive for a certain period of time, what are they going to do with these kids? All right, I'm not sure. Partly, I guess, someone decided that the pollution in the blood washed out after that many generations, and it's okay. Right? Persons of mixed blood of the first degree, to whom up till now, in any sphere of life whatsoever, exception licenses have been issued by the highest party or state authorities. This is, the highest party is Hitler or Goering or someone at that level. Each individual case must be examined, in which process it will still be possible that a decision unfavorable to the persons of mixed blood can be passed. Okay. Anybody think of anyone who might fit into this? There were, in fact, in Europe, even still at this time, Jewish scientists. All right. One of the things, the Nazi basing their system on race eliminated, essentially eliminated nuclear physics as a possibility for the German war machine, because unfortunately in 5 or 6 different countries in Europe, unfortunately for the Germans, I guess fortunately for us, 5 or 6 countries in Europe, the major nuclear physicists at that time happened also to be Jewish. They were Jewish. I mean, my mother wouldn't consider them Jewish. Some of them never went to synagogue. Einstein, you know, in those days, she certainly didn't consider him a nice Jewish boy. But Germany did. Einstein, and in fact, they labeled nuclear physics as Jewish science, and it was a polluted kind of science. Again, fortunately for us. Okay, so they're going to check on these individuals. So even though racially these people maybe aren't okay, we're going to let them pass. Right? Then we come down to persons of mixed blood of the second degree. This is the bottom of page 11. Persons of mixed blood of the second degree will fundamentally be treated as persons of German blood, with the exception of the following cases in which persons of mixed blood of the second degree will be treated as Jews. Okay, this is where I come in. The person of mixed blood of the second degree is the result of a marriage where both parents are persons of mixed blood, okay? Because they talk about the mongrelization of the races, and this somehow seems to be a very, I mean, mathematically it doesn't make sense. These people are no more, there's no more, I mean, if you think of it in terms of blood, there's no more Jewish blood in these people coming from 2 mixed marriages than there is in the other setup, okay? B, the general appearance of the person of mixed blood of the second degree is racially particularly objectionable, so that he already outwardly must be included among the Jews. All right. I really wonder, you know, what would have happened to Goebbels at this point if he'd been discovered to be of mixed blood. Okay. That is, people that look like me. I now learn people that are considered sexually attractive in Europe because they're hairy would have been put to death. Right? Considered Jews even if you were mixed blood. Okay. The person of mixed blood of the second degree has a particularly bad police and political record sufficient to reveal that he feels and behaves like a Jew. Okay. Does this sound like race science to you? I don't know. You know. So they're also talking about Jewish behaviors now. Right. 3, marriages between full Jews and persons of German blood. Here it must be decided from one individual case to another whether the Jewish partner is to be evacuated, or whether, in consideration of the effects by such measure upon the German relatives. Okay, basically, if we can do it, we'll do it. Right? If it's too much trouble, if this person is too high up, if this is too much of a problem, we won't do it. Okay. There were, by the way, many people married to, many non-Jewish people married to Jews in Germany, and a significant number of those people actually hid their spouse all the way through the war, which is another thing to me which is totally amazing. But in 1945, people came out that had been hiding in basements and closets and all kinds of places. The spouse had said, I don't know what happened to him, he's gone, or she's gone, and then had basically taken care of that part. And there were many people who didn't, who said goodbye, right? This is often, it depended not just on devotion, it depended on what kind of people those people were, you know, whether you believe this stuff or not. They obviously couldn't believe it too much. They got married in the first place. All right. Then there's some more things. All right. Then we'll go into all of that. All right. They were still talking about this in 1942. They were trying to work out what they were going to do with all these various mixed blood people. In Italy, at this time, after they'd passed the laws in 1938, they included, the wording was slightly different. They talked about people of Semitic origins and people of Hamitic origins. Anyone have any idea of who the people of Hamitic origins would be? Blacks, okay? So in Italy, they had to make sure they're going to classify the blacks to, I mean, the Germans, I mean, they had some nasty things to say about black people, but they didn't have any black people to speak of, although there is some question as to what happened to hundreds of mixed birth French Senegalese people who were living in France during the time that the Germans occupied France. The Germans published pictures of these, made statements about how decadent the French were, you know, interbreeding with black people, and then many or most of these people were not found after the war. They did not make a big deal out of where they took them. All right. But in Italy, there were blacks to deal with. Italy had taken over Ethiopia. There were Ethiopians sort of long-term. There was a relationship with Ethiopia before Italy took over Ethiopia. There were, in fact, Jewish blacks in Ethiopia. I guess all they can have to be thankful for is that it was the Italians who were handling this. All right, and the Italians. I mean, it was kind of a joke all the way through the 40s that the Italians were, you know, not to be feared in the way that the Germans were to be feared in terms of being soldiers. But it wasn't just that. The Italians just didn't buy this. They put the laws out. They didn't go along. The Italians are a difficult people to manage. It's sort of proverbial about the Italians. And in Italy, even though Italy was an ally of the Germans, many people survived. They just interfered. Even Italian fascists, saying all Italian fascists, but there were high up Italian fascists who just interfered with the deportations. They made it difficult for the Germans to accomplish their goals. They were not the goals of Italy. Okay. Where else? Wherever they, oh, here, all right, here's where we have to look and see where they wanted all these laws to go into effect. Last page of your handout. Deportations to the east of all Jews residing in the German Reich, inclusive of those who live in Croatia, Slovakia, and Romania. This is what they're going to do, right? This is their job now. Deportation of all Jews living in the territories occupied by us who were formerly German citizens but lost their citizenship and are now stateless in accordance with this latest supplementary decree of the Reich Citizens Law. Okay. Deportation of all Serbian Jews. Deportation of the Jews handed over to us by the Hungarian government, all right, which at this point wasn't handing over Jews. All right. To declare our readiness to the Romanian, Slovakian, Croatian, Bulgarian, and Hungarian governments to deport to the east the Jews living in those countries. To influence the Bulgarian and Hungarian governments to issue laws concerning Jews similar to the Nuremberg laws. All right? So they considered that this was the first step. They had to get their allies or their client states to go along with their definitions. All right? Just a couple of examples. In Slovakia, right? Slovakia was a particularly anti-Semitic area. Slovakia had a sort of puppet government headed by a Catholic priest named Tiso, okay? But he was a Catholic priest. Right? One of the arguments that came up in Italy from the Vatican was that this law doesn't make any sense. You're going to be taking Catholics away because they're of Jewish blood. They qualify racially as Jews, but they're Catholics. This is going to undermine the Catholic Church. We have people that have converted in good faith to this religion, not after these laws came in. I'm talking about 20 years ago or 30 years ago. We're talking about people whose parents became Catholics. And now they're suddenly discovering that they're Jews. They didn't like it. The Italians didn't like it and argued about it. In Slovakia, he just basically said, no, these aren't Jews, these are Catholics. If they were Catholics before 1920, whatever it was, they're Catholics now. If they had children, they're Catholic children. No reluctance to deport Jews. No willingness to take, well, actually, to some extent in Slovakia and some other places, people converted to Catholicism successfully avoided being deported. In France, there were Catholics who objected to this whole thing. So they felt like they had to sell this racist ideology first so they could accomplish the task of getting rid of the Jews, and they did. Essentially, country after country adopted these laws, deported their people, back and forth on whether they were willing to do it after it was clear. Maybe it wasn't clear to anyone but me who wasn't there. After it was clear that the Germans were losing the war, they still went along with this. They still went along with these ideas. It's, part of what these maps have to do with. That's what sociology, I guess, is one of the things that it's about. After things happen, you try and figure out why. You try and figure out what connections there are, not biologically like Paul was talking about, but what do people have in common? What factors are there that would lead, as a group, something to happen like happened in Denmark, right? What happened in Denmark? By the way, did King Christian put on the gold star and lead all the rest of the noble Danes in walking through the streets of whatever the cities in Denmark are, saying, we're all Jews, you can't deport us? Huh? Well, he wasn't right. It's a nice story. Actually, the king apparently said that he would do that, you know, that he considered himself. The situation in Denmark was that all the Jews were Christians, all right? In order to be a citizen of Denmark, you had to be a member of the Danish state church. So even though you had religious freedom and you could go to synagogue, you were also a member of the Danish state church. And you were a Danish citizen. You had to pay taxes to the Danish state church. I mean, you know, the United States of America has a written constitution that says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion, and we think this is a wonderful thing, and that it makes us all free, and we're not going to be persecuted. In Denmark, they don't have that rule. In fact, you are obligated to support the church even though you're Jewish. It seemed to work. Basically, the Danes considered everybody who was Danish to be a Dane, even if those Danes were Jewish. On every level, they were Danes. They were citizens. They were members of the church. They were Aryans. If the Danes were Aryans, they considered their Jews to be Aryans. That's not to say that there weren't Danish Nazis. But the government, the people as a group, considered the Jews to be, that were Danish Jews, to be their people. Okay. So they responded accordingly. They also only had about 5,000 people to deal with. They were right next door to Sweden. The Nazis were not moving around Denmark kidnapping Danish children. Right? Denmark had basically capitulated early on. The Nazis were there occupying the country in a certainly lighter fashion than they were in a place like Poland. Right? Because they considered the Poles to be less than human, Untermenschen. Right? So in Denmark, the fact that the Jews were integrated into the society helped. It also helped, I think, that the Germans considered the Danes to be somebody they didn't want to mess with. That's in this handout also. It says certain Scandinavian countries, we'd have disturbances if we tried to, et cetera, so we won't do that. In Finland, the Germans certainly knew what they were getting into with Finland, okay, because Finland, they had a whole war going on where the Germans decided to make alliances with Finland. They deported 8 people from Finland, and the only reason they deported them is because the Germans sort of fooled the Finns into thinking they were criminals, and once they found out what was going on and that they were doing this on the basis of race, the Finns wouldn't give them any more of the Jews. Again, there weren't very many Jews there to give them. Right? So the whole idea of racism and the whole idea of what happened to the Jews, to a certain extent, depended on how the Nazis considered the people in that country. Right? Danish Jews had a better shot at getting away. Finnish Jews, nobody was going to come after them. The Germans were not going to mess with the Finns just to pick up a couple of Jews. There was very little anti-Semitism in those countries. Those countries didn't see any great advantage in turning over the Jews, certainly not after the war was essentially lost by the Germans. Right? The Germans exploited what anti-Semitism there was, even in countries like Poland, where the whole racial ideology was, certainly the Poles couldn't believe in the Nazi ideology wherein they were also set up to be slaves, but there were advantages to them, or it fit in with their own prejudices, or for whatever reason they bought into it. And the result was that this racial ideology resulted in the mass murder of millions of people. Where are we? We're finished. Okay. I just want to say one thing. It didn't stop. Right after World War II, certainly in Poland, thousands of people were murdered after the Germans were no longer in power by people who had gotten into the idea that you could do this, that it was acceptable to murder people of another group. In South Africa, after World War II, the same people who brought you this racial theory, really the same people who brought you this racial theory, established apartheid in South Africa. When you read about ethnic cleansing In Europe now, they'll tell you that it has nothing to do with race. In some ways, I believe I tell a Serbian from a Croatian. The only thing, there's some variation in their religion, and they use different alphabets, okay? But they're murdering each other. They murdered each other during World War II, based on the fact that one was a Serbian and one was a Croatian. This is a very, very insidious concept that I think we're all obligated to oppose. Thank you.
We've gone a little over time. I suggest that those of you who have to leave, maybe we could take a minute for you to get out gracefully, and those who want to stay and ask questions are certainly welcome to do so.